So creating and working with clipping masks in Illustrator. Basically, what a clipping mask is a shape or object, path, compound path, that you use to mask out other objects that are in Illustrator, right? You can think about it kind of like, oh, why am I blanking? Like you do to photos, to pictures. Why am I blanking? On like is it a mask? No? You guys are all looking at me like, what are you talking about? You know, like when you frame something and you have like a border in the thing.
An actual like physical.
Yeah, I'm really professional today.
Okay.
Holy cow. A mat. Thank you. I kept thinking mask and I was like, no, mask. That's not right. That's not right. A mat. Yes, thank you. Holy cow. It's definitely Monday. So think of it as kind of like a mat, right? Is the sort of decent analogy for it. So you're going to be using this object, for example, and this is actually one of the exercises that we're going to be working with. You're going to be using this object to clip out everything that is outside of this object, right? So that's kind of how you can think about it, like a mat. I know mat's not like a perfect analogy, but you know, you kind of get the idea that way. So let's open up. Well, layers is way down at the bottom. All right, I'm gonna pull our layers palette out so we can see it nicer than that. I'm just dropping out. I'm dropping down my layers here just so we can see. And then we're going to start to work more in depth with layers. We're going to start to play around with layers a little bit with this set of exercises. And then next chapter, we're going to start really getting into layer ordering and really working with layers. I know we've played around with it a little bit here and there this semester, but you can see in our layers here, let's open this wider maybe. Come on. There we go. So we can actually see our layer names. So working with your layers palette is also another way to be able to select objects. I think I went through this way earlier in the semester, but you have these little target buttons here at the end, and then this little blue thing indicates, as it says, indicates selected object. So it's another way to select objects. I think I mentioned it when we were working with, I think, our clock assignment or something like that, on different ways to select. And you can still hold shift to select multiples. I'm just holding down our shift button, so we are selecting all 4 of these. And I believe, yeah, there we go. Unlike if you're in your Finder, if you're in a Mac, or you're in your Explorer, if you're in a PC, when you hold shift and you click on, so I'm just going to click on one of these. When you hold shift and click on, like, let's say this 4th one down, generally when you're in like any kind of like operating system interface or selecting things, when you're holding shift, it will select everything in between. But in this case, in your layers palette, it doesn't work like that way. And I don't think it works that way in Photoshop either. I think you have to actually like physically select everything you actually want to select. It's just sort of like a side note. Because sometimes people think it's gonna, whatever. They think it's gonna actually select all these objects, but it will only allow you to like actually target sort of one at a time. So if you wanted to select all of our gold-ish circles we have here, we've used that target selection and holding shift, and now we have all of them selected to either move, or you can group, and then you'll see now they're in a group that's just called group. You can also rename, we're not going to get into it here, but you can also double click and rename. Again, I'll get more in depth next semester. So we have our path, which is our rectangle, again, which we're going to be using as our clipping mask, to mask out this object. So let's say we wanted to sort of create this more sort of textured look rather than these overlapping circles, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to select, and again, you can do this a couple different ways. You can just drag and select, or now that we have these objects grouped, you can click your circles and then hold shift and click your square, and then you'll see your indicators are on. Or again, you can, let's click off, you can click your target buttons, select both of those groups, or the group and the shape. And then to make our clipping mask, it's actually really easy. You're going to go to Object, Clipping Mask, and Make, or Command 7, which is usually what I do most of the time. Command 7, or go to Object, Clipping Mask, and Make, and then you'll see it just kind of like, I don't want to say cut because it doesn't actually cut, like the shapes still exist behind everything. Like you'll see as you hover over, you still get your borders of the shapes. But what it does is it clips out everything that's not within that shape. And you can also, what we're going to do for another piece of the assignment, you'll notice, I'm going to undo, you'll notice that when you apply the clipping mask, that any color attributes will go away. Unlike if you guys have worked with InDesign, working with frames in InDesign, you can still have a fill and a stroke and place objects within a frame. It works somewhat differently. Frames kind of work like clipping masks. That's getting off topic. But you can still have a fill on an object with, like, I don't know, you can have like a pink square with black text, as opposed to if you did that in Illustrator, you wouldn't have the fill anymore. You can, let's go back to making this mask. If you use your direct selection tool, your white arrow, or now you'll see here, let's undo again. We have our path and our group here. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. We have our group and our path, and then when I make that clipping mask, you'll see now it's turned into a clip group. So it groups all the objects together into this clip group, having the mask be on top. And if we arrow that down, you'll see now we have our clipping path and then our group, because I grouped those objects. If I didn't group those, you would see like the circles all listed down in that drop down. You can still either, again, use your direct selection tool, and if you hit the edge of the rectangle, the clipping path, or a lot of times it's easier to use this target, which is why I went over it in the first place. To select your clipping path, you can apply a stroke to it if you'd like to. You'll see as we do, it's on fill right now. So if we apply a fill, nothing happens because it's a clipping mask, right? So you can't apply a fill to a clipping mask because you have objects that it's supposed to be showing sort of like underneath the mask. So fills don't really apply, but you can still put a stroke on a mask. So if you wanted to have like earlier assignments when we talked about drop shadows, and you put a little bit of a stroke and a drop shadow to have something pop out a little bit, you can do a similar thing. You can still apply a stroke, any colors, and you can still do your options where if you wanted a round corner, and if you wanted it on the outside, oops. I guess apparently it won't align to the outside or the inside when you're on a mask. I did not know that. You can only align the stroke to center. But you can still apply your round join or your bevel join, things like that. So you can still do some stroke treatments. When you add a stroke to your mask. So that's essentially, I know that was sort of a long-winded way to do it, but that's essentially clipping mask. You can we've talked about creating compound paths and compound objects. That's part of the last assignment that we're just doing, where we're creating more complex shapes using shapes together. So this group of circles is actually a compound shape. So you can have, the one thing that you have to do, you can have, all right, before I get into that, you can have a mask on top of a mask, theoretically. And a lot of times I would get a lot of work that unnecessarily had masks on top of masks. So for argument's sake, for whatever reason, you wanted to mask out this rectangle, and then also mask out with this ellipse for whatever reason. Let's make this, it's gonna drive me nuts. Let's make this ellipse a little bit further inside here. So let's say for argument's sake, we wanted to mask out all this stuff. You can have masks on top of masks, and a lot of times when I get really funky artwork, mask on top of mask on top of mask on top of mask, and then you have to dig into your layers and find out what this person actually did. You can have masks on top of masks, but let's release this mask. You cannot do two masks at the same time. It automatically, hopefully it gives me an error message, but it automatically will do whatever shape is on top. So this is where I started talking about layer ordering. So the ellipse is on top. So let's see if we mask it out. It's going to mask out everything that we've selected that's under that ellipse, right? So you kind of can't have two shapes create a mask at the same time unless you create a compound path like we are doing for our last assignment. Like this one is, for example, I know it's like 3 separate circles, but if we were to do these 3 separate circles, if they were separate, and let's say we wanted to mask out these 3, whatever this is, the gumball balloons, whatever you want to call it. So we wanted to mask that out, and this was 3 separate circles, kind of like this shape. It would take whatever circle is the topmost circle and mask out the 2 other circles and the colored circles behind it. So now you have to make a compound path, which if you select multiple objects, like in this case, you select the 3 circles and you just hit make, and it makes that compound path. Or you could go back to your Pathfinder and you could even do a unite if you wanted to. Obviously there's nothing overlapping, so it wouldn't really do anything incredibly funky, but it would make it a compound path. In this case, the easiest way to do it is to do compound path, make, and then it turns the 3 objects, as you'll see, into your compound path here. So now we have these 3 circles, and they essentially optically look like, obviously, 3 separate circles. But as far as Illustrator is concerned, they're one path. So we do the same thing, overlapping the objects. We're doing our object. I'm trying not to do the shortcuts. Clipping mask, make, Command 7. And now we have these sort of 3 separate, what looks like 3 separate masks, but since it's using one compound shape, compound path, it gives you the three looks. You could essentially do the same thing by building like this, like I did if you had one circle, mask it out, another circle, mask it out, another circle, but then you're like masking on top of masking and you get into layer ordering, and I actually don't know if that would theoretically work. So it gets kind of funky. So it's easier just to do that compound shape and then make your mask. Lastly, we're talking about ordering after you have your mask sort of set where you want it, or you have it give or take set and you want to move it a little bit. We can get into our clip group here. And I'm going to arrow down, again, I'll zoom in a little bit, into our clip group, and it gives you a little bit of a preview so you can kind of see these are the three shapes that we're working with. So we have our compound clipping mask and our group. You can select your clipping mask, or again, you can use your direct selection and hit the edge of the objects. I find it easier to use my layers. So if you hit your compound clipping mask and you're on your selection tool or direct selection tool in this case, you have all of these selected. You can kind of arrow these over and kind of position these. Try it, there's the edge. Kind of position these a little bit more, you know, how you want them to be. Say you wanted these 2 red ones to be a little bit more center, you know, give or take. And even still, let's say we wanted, you know, this looks a little bit more random. Let's say we wanted to move this orange circle for some reason. This one's a little bit crazier, obviously. You can do this drop down and you'll see there's like and I hit the first one on the first try. Awesome. But you'll see there's a whole bunch of theoretically there should be, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different orange ones. So instead of kind of digging through whichever orange one, and I hit a lucky guess there, and it just happened to be the first one, you can use your direct selection tool here and do the same thing. If you click your object, and you can either arrow it around, so, or just drag it. As long as you are dragging the center, or give or take, you're not hitting the edge, so you're not hitting these anchor points and misshaping it. You can arrange these circles or arrange whatever is inside the mask as much or as little as you want after you've created the mask, just by going into your layers, either using your direct selection or going into your layers. Again, like with this group here at the top, I'm just going to delete this. Since this is a group and you want to move all of these, it might be easier just to select that group, and kind of move these around a little bit to give you whatever look you're going after, right? Let's move that up just a little bit. There we go. So now everything's to the edge, but it's a little bit off center. It looks a little bit more random. In our this is actually the first part of our exercises. The second part of our exercises, we're creating sort of a magnifying glass effect, where you're going to be creating, there's going to be a layer where the word magnify is. I can show you very quickly. Let's go to this one here. So you have these, what you're going to be doing is creating a mask here with this shape. You're going to have these kind of over each other to where this larger magnify is going to be masked out by the magnifying glass. And then as you select this and move it over, you can kind of nudge it like this. Let's go back to our clipping path. You can select, oops, wrong one. Go to this clip group. So for argument's sake, you can use your arrow tool and move your object over like this, and it'll actually give you, theoretically, it's supposed to give you a little bit of like an actual magnifying glass effect, as if you're hovering over it with a magnifying glass. So this one works a little bit with getting more into our layering, because you're going to have these two layers here, where you're going to have this layer kind of not hidden, but masked out, to where if you have, obviously, I'll just do it quick. So if you have these two, I know I forgot my handle, but select a large magnify. So you have this, and then we're going to apply a fill to it later. I'm just going to do this so you can actually see it. So the idea, sort of in general, is to have this sort of, oops, as I selected all of them, going into our layers, go into our clip group, selecting that clipping path, and then it sort of gives you this, like, I know this is like really half of what you're supposed to do, and it looks really bad, but it gives you this sort of quasi magnify effect. Once the illustration's all together, it'll make a lot more sense, and it'll actually sort of look like an illustrated magnifying glass. And then lastly, the last part of the assignment, I'll show you very quickly, is working with layer ordering and masking. We're going to make these objects a compound path, so we can mask out these two objects, but mask out the entire word together. So I'm just going to do Command 7 to create our mask. And a relatively easy-ish way to order things within our layers. Now you see we have our clip group here. I do this a lot, especially when there's like a lot of crazy objects within a mask. We're going to be sort of ordering these. We'll have this positioned, give or take about where we want it, right? And I'm going to cut this using our edit, cut. And then in our clip group, you can either, in this case, there's only 2 objects to choose. So if you choose your clipping mask or your object, your path that it clipped out, we're going to select the object, which is essentially that green rectangle, right? And this is where something I really like in Illustrator, we talked about a little bit. We're going to paste in front. So what that does, it's kind of like, you can also do that by dragging your layers into each other. But honestly, with something like this, I find it a little bit easier to do that cut and paste in front or in back. So now you'll see, since we pasted it in front of that green object, it pasted it not only obviously in front of that green object, but it also put it behind the clipping mask automatically. So we didn't have to like release that mask and redo it. You can just kind of do that. And it's sort of like a quickish way to layer order. So let's say we wanted this one, give or take, here. So I'm going to cut, and I just did my Command X. And let's say we want it to be behind this one or in front of this one. It's essentially the same thing. We're going to do a paste behind that path. So I'm going to do paste in back or Command B. And now we have that in front of the green, but behind this guy. And again, you can do the same thing here. Position that, give or take where you want it. I'm going to do a Command X for cut. And then I'm actually going to paste it in front of this sort of squiggle that we have. So I'm going to do a Command F. And again, you'll see now it's behind the mask, but it's in front. So it's a relatively quick way to order things and include things within a mask and order objects. And that's going to be the last part of our assignment. And again, when we start to work a little bit with layer ordering, again, once you have everything behind the mask, let's say you don't like how this one is actually in front of this, you can actually grab your layer and just hold and drag, and you see you get the little hand. And let's say we want it behind that squiggle, you get the blue line, highlights, and now you've just dragged it. Excuse me. You've just dragged it behind now that squiggle line, whatever we're going to call that, but it's still in front of your green rectangle. So once you get everything like behind your clipping mask, you can either do a cut and paste in front or back, which honestly I do a lot, or you can actually layer order once everything is inside this mask. You can kind of drag around and order however you see fit.